How are we doing today, guys? Today we're going to be talking about sled variations, so specifically sled push, sled drag, and the lateral sled drag. These are going to be specifically in relation to translation of force through the floor, so we're not going to be talking about creating necessarily just pushing a sled for the sake of pushing a sled. We're going to be talking about pushing a sled for the sake of creating patterns and positions that are going to be very, very relevant in sprinting and creating horizontal force production, which is what sleds are actually really good for, because they allow you to slow the movement down enough and hold shapes and spend time in positions to familiarize yourself with them, to then go and replicate those positions when you're sprinting and things like that. Obviously, if you want to get good at sprinting, you need to sprint. There's no question there. However, learning positions is quite crucial. And obviously doing things like A marches, B marches, things like that are beneficial, and 100% they do train those shapes, but putting them into a position where you can actually translate the force horizontally versus just creating the shapes vertically does mean that you can basically just drill the positions a little bit more specifically, and you can also tie into that force production rather than just being obviously about the recoil on the ground. So training things like A skips and B skips combined with sled-based variations and things like straight leg bounding, stuff like that, all these things tying in together make for a really good holistic way of training force production to the ground, but incorporating both the recoil components of things as well as the force production component of things. So we're going to start off with the sled push. So big thing with the sled push is you want to be thinking about getting used to being leant forwards and then creating as much extension as possible. Now, this also ties into the rib cage and hip positioning in comparison to the rest of the body. So what we're looking for specifically is we're looking to create flexion through the upper back as your first and foremost priority. Reason for that is the same as what we've talked about on GHD stuff, is that when you create flexion through the spine, relative to the rib cage, the hip has to move forwards, or greater extension. And if you watch a lot of sprinters, they'll hold a flex position during their acceleration phase, because it allows them to, one, get their weight forwards, to move their center of mass forwards into the toes, into the forefoot of the position. It allows them to keep their angle of motion aggressive and, again, forwards. On top of that, it allows them to hold a lot of compression, and compression, the same as lifting, allows for a lot of force production to be created at the extremities. So when we're talking about creating as much force as possible, and that's basically what we're talking about when we're talking about sleds, we want to create a flex position. Where a lot of people go wrong is they sit there and they'll extend their upper back and they'll let their arms drop back. Now my spine's sitting extension. It's really hard to get a good hip extension in that position, but also relative to my center of mass, my mass has moved backwards there, which means that, as in my center of mass has moved backwards, which means that I'm actually basically training a more upright position. The whole point of a sled push is to put you into a position where you're mimicking your first initial acceleration and the force production around that, where the ground contact times can be highest and the force production is going to be highest. So there's no point drilling an extended position, which is going to be closer to a little bit more of a top speed sort of shape, and even then we're not even really sitting into extension anyway, but in comparison to a fully flexed position in the acceleration, there is a slight extension there. But we want to make this as specific to your running components as you possibly can. If you're not sitting in that flex position, you're literally training yourself out of the shape that we want to be in. So first and foremost, we want to create flexion. So this means protraction, means a flexed upper back. I'm going to be deliberately leaning into that. In terms of grip position, like some people like the vertical, some people like hands on top of the bar. Again, depends, it's fine, doesn't really matter too much what you're doing as long as you're hitting the right space in the spine. From there, I'm going to be deliberately creating that flexion. I want to create a lean forward, so I'm deliberately going to push that sled slightly further forwards to allow me to lean forwards further into it. From there, I'm going to be deliberately trying to create extension. I'm going to be trying to create triple extension. So I'm trying to flex the ankle. From there, I'm trying to extend the knee, trying to flex the hip, and obviously I'm going to be sitting into my sprinter position. Now, That shape is what we're looking for at the end of every single step, is mimicking that full range extension at a torso angle or a body angle that's going to mimic your sprinting accelerations. So that's why having a big lean on the sled is quite crucial, quite important. So from here, if I actually go into the actual sled push itself, I'm going to step into that action. I'm going to be creating that torso angle first, flexion in the upper back. From there, I'm going to extend that ankle, knee, and hip. From there, I'm going to keep myself leant forwards. I'm going to step into my sprinter. I'm going to strike underneath my center of mass, or slightly behind my center of mass, aka the hip. Basically, just in above the hip for center of mass. But that's what we've spoken about previously in other steps. But I'm striking just in front of, behind that or underneath it. From there, I'm going to be creating that, being into this flexed position here. I'm going to switch legs so you can see that. So when I'm in that flexed position, that's when I'm going to be setting myself to drive again. So upper back is flexed, everything else, I'm going to deliberately just finish my extension. From there, I'm going to press with the other leg. I'm going to drive through. I'm creating extension through the knee, the ankle, and the hip, all at the same time to get to full extension again. Now, big thing when we're talking about that shape and me slowly going through that position is what you should have noticed is that the ankle didn't move, the hip didn't move, the spine didn't really move. The knees, the hips, and the ankle extending, as in it didn't move from the point at which it made contact, is what's going to drive the hips and the torso forwards. If there's any other movement, torso coming up, hips traveling up and creating that bouncing action, ankle collapsing into the ground, all those things are going to be wasted power. We are trying to maximize force production here. So we want to be deliberately trying to stabilize everything else so that there is no waste in power. So if I go through that again, but I mimic the same shape. So let's just hypothetically say I've just finished my extension with this back leg. I'm leant into that shape. I'm sitting happy. I'm trying to contact with the ground with my other foot. Now, if I immediately, as I lift this foot off the ground, collapse through that ankle on this side, my knee is just extended further and my hip is just extended further, and I've gone nowhere. Literally, the sled has moved nowhere. Whereas if I was to, the sled has moved nowhere. This means that you've just wasted a whole bunch of energy, as well as you've increased your ground contact time and your reduced amount of potential force that you can create. Not to mention that you've just killed your stretch reflex out of the ankle, which means that you're never going to get any recoil out of that position. So we don't want to be doing that. So if I come in again, if I land into that position, now this time I start to extend, but my hip starts to raise or my chest starts to raise, same sort of thing. So you can create that flexion there and have the hip raise, but less people are likely to do that. Whereas the chest raising is quite common. And again, I was able to raise my chest and basically extend my leg, and the sled didn't move. Again, wasted power, wasted energy, etc. So whenever you're doing a sled push, you're trying to make sure that every single thing is being put into actually physically making that sled move and create an action. So if I go through a proper action, I've just finished my extension, flexing the upper back, extended through the other leg, fully extended through the toe. From that position, I'm going to contact into the ground, and then from there, my ankle's not going to move. I'm going to deliberately push through that. My quad, my knee, my hip is extending to create that forwards movement. Now, every action there resulted in forward sled movement. And that's what we're trying to create and build, is the coordination through your joints to actually create forwards movement. If you don't create forwards movement, everything's being wasted, or large chunks of it are. So with the sled push, make sure you're being specific to what you want to create, and make sure that you're mimicking positions that are actually going to result in the action that you want. If your hips are bouncing up and down, if your ankle's collapsing all the time, if your rib cage is moving up and down, extended flex, etc., all these things are going to result in wasted energy. Wasted energy is ultimately just going to mean that you're not going anywhere or gaining anything from the process. So, what we want from this, make sure you're thinking about creating movement that's useful. So that's our sled push. We're going to go into sled drag. I'm just going to push this a little bit further so we've got a little bit more space to go into. So sled drag obviously is the reverse. Now this means that it's mostly related to the deceleration phase. So really interesting thing when we look at GPS data or things like that is that most people do far more decelerations in some capacity than they do accelerations inside a game generally. And this may seem what's the word? Unusual, because obviously for people to have a deceleration they must have an acceleration, but when you start to refer to the magnitude at which they do those things, that's where you get the big difference. So it's very common for people in sports, yes, they will accelerate if they need to for a ball or chase a player, etc. really quickly, but they'll typically do that at different magnitudes throughout the game. So players aren't involved in every single ball all the time, which means that those acceleration phases happen less frequently or they happen at lower intensities. And people quite often are already moving when they create that acceleration. So if I'm creating my acceleration, I might have gone from a jog, in which case the acceleration is going to be a lot less intense. Versus the deceleration phase, where the deceleration phase is going to happen at quite high intensities regardless of what's going on. So if I'm moving into a change of direction, I'm still going to decelerate quite hard to then change directions, as well as decelerating itself as just a general principle. So deceleration is a really crucial component of sport, but we also want to train the specifics of it, and this is where positionally we want to drill into. And it's also something that's not trained very often. Everyone's always worried about acceleration, they never actually focus on deceleration. But you can only accelerate as well as you can brake, which is an interesting concept as well. Anyway, so thinking into this, we want to be thinking about creating, shifting your mass backwards. So again, where a lot of people go wrong when they're doing these sorts of things, they try and pull themselves forwards. Whereas really, to decelerate, you need to have your feet outside your center of mass, aka out from underneath your hips or center of mass around the midline, to allow yourself to drive your heel into the ground and to push backwards, same way that you'd lean forwards to allow yourself to create forwards momentum. Now this means that the shins must travel either vertically or they must be pushed negatively. In the same way that with the sled push, we're actually trying to create positive shin angles. So you're deliberately trying to basically reverse all the actions that you're thinking about with your sled push. Now the only thing that doesn't change is the ribcage position. So from here, I'm deliberately trying to create flexion through the upper back. I'm deliberately trying to pull my tailbone backwards, and you can already start seeing that there's a lot of tension on that strap. From there, I'm going to deliberately try and push through the heel, and I can literally just lean back there, and I'm not even trying to push through my legs, and that sled starts to move. Same thing as and this is all about, again, center of mass manipulation. Now, this is exactly what we're talking about when we're trying to create deceleration. The better that you manipulate your center of mass, the better that you're going to be able to actually control how you move that sled forwards and backwards to create the action that we're looking for, and to allow yourself to decelerate yourself when you're actually traveling at high speeds. So, cues that we're thinking about. Flexion through the upper back, tailbone pulls backwards, drive the heels into the ground, but still push the ankle into the ground at the same time, and then from there, you're trying to push through the quads to extend those knees to allow yourself to move backwards. All of these things are the concentric phases that you would do eccentrically when you're doing a deceleration. So by that I mean, when I come down into a deceleration phase, I'm going to be hitting the ground in elongated state. I'm going to control that foot down to the ground. My knee's going to bend. I'm deliberately going to try and stop it at around that vertical shape. And I'm trying to press backwards to slow myself down. And all of that's happening where the muscles are lengthening. We're doing this in a concentric phase, and it just means that the muscles are contracting and shortening rather than doing it through the eccentric phase, which can be useful for strengthening, but again, also familiarization with positions. So when we're doing the sled drag, you want to be obviously mimicking those shapes and trying to create fast little patterns with the feet. You keep the short steps relatively short because again, during a deceleration phase, we're not trying to take big steps to get away. We're trying to actually deliberately push back and create a lot of force into the ground quite quickly, which means that you want to have short, fast steps, and we want to mimic that when we're going into these sorts of sled positions. So, leaning back into it, flexion, tailbone back, push back, push back, push back, push back, push back. And it's happening all in very short, fast step rates. So, those are our deceleration phase. Now, final thing that we're talking about is lateral motion. Now, there's lots of ways to travel laterally, and particularly when you're on the field, like you need to be able to twist and turn as well as push off laterally, dependent on what you need to do and how you want to do it. So, for the gym, we need to be a little bit more structured than that. And again, you can obviously just tell people to go into certain different shapes. But in this specific case, we're going to be talking about deliberately driving adduction through the hip and abduction. Adduction is adding your legs together. So adduction is pulling inwards and abduction is taking it away. I'm taking the leg away from the other leg. So this is where we're talking about our adductors and our abductors, aka glutes and a few of the other muscles in the leg. Which you're going to be working on, basically pushing yourself laterally. So we're going to be talking about a more strict lateral strength than we're talking about necessarily moving as fast as possible. So when we're doing this, the actions that we want to be searching for. First things first, we want to make sure that we're keeping our feet pointing forwards. Now this is really, really crucial for sports players because quite often people want to do this, and the end result of that is they're not actually training the lateral portions of the ankle. So as much as the hip is doing a lot of work here, the foot and the ankle are actually doing quite a fair bit of work as well. We're through pronation or putting pressure through the inside edge of the foot, which is a good thing, it's fine, it's natural, people do it all the time. The knee coming in isn't always a bad thing. Or supination, where it's pressure on the outside of the foot, which is getting basically a little bit of external rotation, but we're talking about creating a stopping force on the outside. So we want to be able to create both those forces as we're doing this, as well as what we talked about with the hip. So I'm going to hold on to this strap. From there, I'm going to deliberately lean into that, and I'm going to create a nice straight line from my foot all the way through to my shoulder. So I'm not thinking about trying to have this sort of action going on where I'm really leaning into it, where I'm not getting any sort of hip engagement, but really again, I'm just drilling a vertical leg position there rather than lateral. So, as I lean into that, I'm going to be pushing through this outside leg to begin with. Now, to do that, I'm going to be creating supination. I'm going to be pressing through the outside of that foot as well as through the inside, but the inside I'm already forced into pronation, so I'm going to be driving supination or pressure through the outside of the foot. From there, I'm also going to be putting pressure through the glutes and using my abductors to push away. So if I set into that position, I'm going to be deliberately trying to press through the outside of the foot and straighten the leg out to create pressure through the outside of the leg. Other action that we're looking for is creating adduction. So if I step into this position again, I'm going to do deliberately starting with this leg bent underneath my center of mass. I'm going to be trying to pull through that foot in terms of creating a pulling action across to create adduction through the inside of the leg, as well as creating pronation or pressure through the inside of my foot to allow myself to drive laterally. So when we're doing the lateral sled drag, it's literally switching from one to the other to create adduction and abduction. So if I go again, all I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be deliberately setting myself. I'm going to deliberately place foot on the ball, foot on the ground, underneath my center of mass. From there, I'm going to straighten the hips up. I'm going to deliberately drive through the inside edge of my foot, the inside of the leg, to create a pressure through and create a locking action. From there, I'm going to stand into the underneath my center of mass again. I'm going to press through the outside of my foot, and I'm going to create supination and abduction to pull across. So it's constantly having that stepping action across and across and across. So I'm going to do a couple more reps, that way you can kind of see that again. And obviously you can do this you need to be able to do this on both sides. So if I'm holding on my left hand, I'm leading with my right. And that's going to mean I'm working on abduction on this side and adduction on this side. If I switch that around, now I'm going to be working on abduction on my right side and adduction on my left side. So we want to be making sure that we're training both sides. Anyway, continuing on. So I'm holding onto that strap. I'm going to be leaning into that position. From there, I'm striking underneath my mass, toe points forwards. I'm going to be deliberately driving through my internal rotators and my adductors and pronation inside of the foot to create that pressing action through, step under. I'm pushing away from the body, pressing into the body, pressing away from the body, into the body. And that's where you can create that lateral movement. So the lateral sled drag is all about training positions to teach the body to push and pull, because that's all we're really doing is pushing, pulling, pushing, pulling. It's really, really good for creating strength through the outside of the ankles, for like ankle strains, things like that, as well as also teaching the hip and the ankle to move well, to absorb force and then produce force laterally, which is quite useful for particularly things like lateral jumping and change of direction. Because if I'm coming into there, I need to be able to push and then drive out. But quite often people will also need to plant in the inside leg and rotate and drive out through the inside leg. So being able to do both actions is quite important. And again, typically people are strong in one of them. Like what people quite often find is they're quite strong through the outside when they press, but they're weak through the inside, or the reverse. They're strong through the inside, but they don't like to push through the outside. So this is where strengthening these positions will make them stronger in general throughout all of their change of direction movements, rather than necessarily just specifically training change of direction by itself. Obviously, this needs to be combined with on-field stuff. All of this stuff does, but this is just how to make it more specific inside the gym so that they can obviously create better amounts of force, and then they can work on their recoil-based movements as they get onto the field. Hope you guys enjoyed that. If you have any questions, please message. Other than that, see you later.